Welcome back to the podcast Unbinding the Bible. This is episode 157, Persecution and Privilege. And on the podcast this week, I would like us to take a little bit of time to look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 10 through 12, which conclude Jesus' Beatitudes with a couple of exhortations to his followers about persecution. And so I want to take a little bit of time today to talk about that, and using Skye Jethani's book, What If Jesus Was Serious? He does a great job in his short 2 pages of chapter on this topic, doing a little bit of compare and contrast with persecution and privilege. And I do want to talk about the distinction between the two, and not necessarily seeing loss of privilege as the same thing as persecution. And I'm so glad for Skye's insights, because I think this is desperately needed to just be talked about openly, honestly, publicly today in the church in particular, because far too many things are being labeled persecution that really aren't. And I think we need to be honest with that evaluation and assessment, and just think about what Jesus might actually be saying to his followers. And so that's what I want to do in this week's episode. And so let's just get right into it. This week over Messenger, I received a really encouraging message from a listener to the podcast who I think is actually back in the Genesis episodes at the present time, and is maybe up through episode 32 or 33, somewhere in there, but reached out and said he was encouraged by the podcast and wondered if I had any kind of a reading list of the sort of books that have influenced me over the years. And my assumption is that maybe this listener hasn't yet found our By the Book series, which is my attempt to talk directly with the authors whose books have really influenced me. But in response to his question, I really began to think about it. And I kind of scanned my shelves at home, which is where most of my most meaningful resources are at the present time. I do most of my work from my home. I do have a church office with several more books there, but most of the ones I reach for on the shelves on a regular basis are here in my living room. And as I began to think about it, I thought, there really are lots of books that have really been the most meaningful to me and the most influential. And I probably could break them down into a couple of categories. The first being biblical interpretation or theology books. And then the second being, books of spiritual growth, self-awareness, that type of a thing. And so I compiled a list on a Word document and emailed it to him, and we've been dialoguing a little bit. But I thought that's definitely something that I want to make available to you as listeners on the podcast, if you'd be interested. Instead of me just rattling off a bunch of titles with authors for several minutes on the episode, I'll just leave that alone. But if you would like to know what that list is, if you want to pick up a new book for 2023, maybe something on the list you've never read, the ones that I put there, I think I have about 20 on the theology and the biblical theology, biblical interpretation section, and then I think an additional 8, which I would probably add more to if you talk to me in a month. But as of right now, I have 28, so 8 in that emotional health, spiritual growth type category. And so if you're interested in that, please just send me an email, unbindingthebible@gmail.com. I'm happy to attach that document and send it right back. And that way you can have it and gain benefit from that. If that would be something you're interested in, I'd be happy to send it to you. So this week on the podcast, what I want to do is I want to look at Matthew 5, 10 to 12. And let me just start by reading that section, and then I'll make a few comments about it. Here's what Jesus says. "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Now, I may have said this already on the podcast, and if I haven't, I will say it many times from this point forward, and that is that the Sermon on the Mount is probably one of the most one of the most forgotten sections of the Bible. I bet, just period. The most forgotten section of the Bible. It's a section that it is so radical in its teaching that many, many, many Christians, if not most, who claim to follow Christ, don't really take what Jesus says seriously. And I mean that 100%. I am stealing the concept, of course, from Skye's book, What If Jesus Was Serious? But the premise of his book is outstanding. And that is that we love to ignore certain passages that don't fit with the kind of lifestyle that we want to live, that don't fit with the kind of way we imagine Jesus has really come to set up his kingdom. And this one about persecution really fits the bill, because it is odd for us to consider that people who have false things said about them, or who are reviled, or who are mistreated as a result of their following Jesus, that's something that you would consider yourself blessed if that happens to you. That typically, in the churches that I've been a part of and the Christians that I know, when things like that happen, we are shocked by it. We are appalled. We are outraged. We are angry. And we let the people who are impeding on what we perceive to be the freedoms we have as Christians, we want to attack them. We want to get them out of positions of influence. We want to, tweet or put stuff online that says nasty things about those kinds of people, instead of recognizing that this is built into the fabric of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And I think today, we see this all over the place. We've got a culture right now. I was just talking with someone last night who was posing the question, why do we think that several churches in the area are not seeing as much success as they once did? And of course, that's a huge question with potentially dozens, if not more, answers, to the question. But we're in this time right now where there's a lot of divisiveness, there's a lot of disagreement. People don't like something that you say or think or do, and then your opinion no longer matters, right? Like nothing you ever say or do or think will hold any water. And I know I have one foot firmly in the conservative camp, because that's where I grew up, and I'm still a part of that in my church. And then I have another foot that understands the questions that the church gets and understands some of the frustrations that people outside the church have with the church. And so I do consider it a large part of my job in life to continue to straddle those two things, not to ride the fence in the negative sense of the metaphor, but rather to try to help both groups understand one another. And that's really what I see happening. But today, when it comes to persecution, there's a strong temptation to cry foul when something isn't actually a foul. And I came across on my Facebook feed a fantastic little quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American essayist in the mid to mid 19th century. He was a lecturer, philosopher, abolitionist, poet. You might know him. You may not agree with some of what he's written, and that's fine, but I'm never of the opinion that just because somebody doesn't say something that isn't completely in line with what you think, that you can't listen to anything they say. But Ralph Waldo Emerson was quoted as saying the following: "Let me never fall into the vulgar mistake of dreaming that I am persecuted whenever I am contradicted." Let me read that for you just one more time. Let me never fall into the vulgar mistake of dreaming that I am persecuted whenever I am contradicted. And I think that that's important, because today dialogue, it seems, gets shut down far too quickly when there is a difference of opinion, because people assume that they can just, well, if you don't agree with me here, well, then you must not agree with God, and therefore you're out in left field. Or if now the position I once had with you is no longer where it once was, then that's persecution, right? I'm being persecuted. Well, what Skye goes on to say in his book, and his opening line is really worth a lot in terms of what I want to talk about today. But that is, if Jesus was serious, Skye says, then we will not see a loss of privilege as persecution. And this is big to me. Let me read just a couple more quotes from Skye's chapter. He says, "It is when we suffer for doing what is right or for being identified with Jesus that we are blessed. But there are plenty of Christians who may claim persecution who are actually suffering due to their own foolish or unrighteous behavior. Some suffer for righteousness, but frankly, some Christians suffer because they are insufferable. They're intolerable, they're unbearable, and they carry themselves in that way. And then when other people don't like that, they, might mistreat this person. Well, you can't cry foul when you've been the kind of person who doesn't warrant any kind of, compassion for somebody else or sympathy for somebody else, and therefore you don't grant that type of treatment in response. And so it's a really fine line between being reviled because you are following Jesus, or being reviled on his account, and being reviled because you're a person who kind of deserves that. Jesus is not saying that every person who is reviled, who is a Christian, is blessed. He's saying on my account. And I think that that's an important distinction to make, especially as Skye uses the phrase loss of privilege, because he says anyone who follows Jesus' way should expect to be misunderstood, maligned, or mistreated. And as I said earlier in this episode, I'm afraid that a lot of times we don't respond with a recognition that we are blessed, and we certainly don't expect this type of treatment. And one of the big reasons I don't think Christians expect it is because for a long period of time, Christianity, as we've come to define it in the West, has been a rather privileged position. In the past, to be a Christian was an honorable thing. To be a pastor was a trusted position of authority. Research tells us today that people trust newspaper reporters more than they trust pastors. Pastors are pretty far down the list. And being a pastor myself, and also knowing so many of the horror stories that I have heard or read about from pastors abusing their authority, misusing their position as pastors, giving terrible counsel to wives in abusive marriages, or mistreating the people in their own church with power plays and power struggles, it doesn't surprise me in the least that pastors are no longer a recognized position of honor. And so I carry that with me as a pastor. I don't attempt to flaunt my authority ever, because my gosh, running roughshod over somebody just because I'm in a position of authority, that's quite literally the opposite of the way Jesus exercised his authority. And so I can't really claim to be following his way and think that I'm going to have a life free of being misunderstood, maligned, or mistreated. And so Skye then concludes with, a desire to be seen as a genuine Christian may cause us to claim persecution where none exists. And I've seen this. It's particularly tempting for us, for those who live in the United States. And it comes up in this way. And Christians that I've been around seem to be so fixated on what around them is happening and what laws are potentially being passed around them that will, in some futuristic hypothetical situation, make their lives as Christians harder. And I get this on a continual basis. And the nature of the conversation typically centers around, we can't believe all these crazy things that are happening in our world and that people are going to start forcing us to do. We're being persecuted. And I listen as long as I can when those concerns are raised. But the big disconnect for me is that the Christian position, if you will, to be a Christian, has not only never been something that has been offered to us as a way of gaining approval in this world or privilege in this world, but whenever you see the Christian position earn a place of approval, it's typically because those Christians are out of step with the ways of Jesus. And so what I think of here when I think of loss of privilege, and I've heard this a lot, right? Let's talk about legally backed freedom to express our faith, right? This is probably the number one reason why people mistakenly come to believe that America is a Christian nation. What they've done is they've conflated, they've just combined the fact that America states its desire for religious freedom, but because one particular narrative circulates that the people who first put that into place were Christians, which is debatable, right? That means that the Christian religion is the one that's supposed to be favored. And that's actually not what America is built on. America is built on the freedom of religion, which means if you hold a different religion, you have the freedom in America to practice that religion. But go say that to any person who holds to the belief that America is a Christian nation, and they will lose their marbles. They won't be able to stomach it, because to them, to be a Christian is the only religion that is acceptable to practice in this country. And so they love the privileged position that the Christian position has. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because when over time it appears as if the privileged position of being a Christian is no longer as privileged as it once was, Christians jump to the conclusion of they're being persecuted. And instead of rejoicing in that, which is what Jesus tells us to do, typically the conversation goes to those terrible liberals, or those people who are trying to take away our Christian freedoms, who are trying to ruin this country. And all of a sudden, the conversation shifts to something entirely different than what Jesus expresses in the Beatitudes. What does he say? Blessed are you. Rejoice and be glad when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Why should you rejoice and be glad? For your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The prophets, those whose lives were made incredibly difficult because they were called by God to bring hope and to bring light and to bring redirection to the nation. You know, you and I read about this in the history books, but what if we actually lived at the time of the prophets? What if we actually were among the prophets? You know, you read in the prophets about their lives, and they're not just guys sitting down in a room with a nice light and a pen and paper and are just writing down thoughts that God has for the nation. No, they are the ones speaking truth to power, to the leaders of Israel, to the kings, to the priests who have corrupted the practices of the people and made it, baptized it in the name of goodness. And they were thrown into pits. They were sawn in two. They were cast out of Israel. They were murdered. They were exiled. All sorts of things took place. And it was, I don't remember how many, several years ago. It was the 50th celebration. I guess this would have been in 2018, if I'm doing my math correctly. But the celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. He died in 1968. He was assassinated. And I heard a little speech given to a Southern Baptist convention by Russell Moore, who proceeded to explain how we will hail Martin Luther King Jr., but had we been alive at the time, or had we been, in his part of the country when he was there, would we have sided with him then? Or now that he is dead and is a voice that can no longer require us to change our ways, do we say, oh yes, what a great man? Well, Jesus addressed this same thing to the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23. He says that you build the tombs for the prophets, but you expose your own hypocrisy, because you would have been the ones killing the prophets based upon the way you're treating me right now. And so this gets really confusing to me, but it gets really confusing because when you live so long in a privileged position and you don't know that you're living in a privileged position, but then that privileged position is removed, you think that that's an attack on you for being a faithful follower of Jesus, when in reality, what it might be is simply a leveling of the playing field, which again is quite literally a kingdom principle. And so when you experience the legalized, backed freedom to express our faith, that does not make the legalized practice of our faith the same thing as Christianity. It doesn't make it the same thing as following Jesus. In other words, let me give an example. Just because prayer in schools was once legal and acceptable does not make it persecution when that practice is put to an end. No one in first century Judaism experienced any type of privileged position. None. But Christians in America have experienced all sorts of privileged positions. And so when thinking about persecution rightly, or being mistreated or maligned or reviled in the name of Jesus, don't compare present day America to 1950s America as if 1950s America is the biblical standard. Hint, it's not. Rather, we might compare present-day America to first-century Israel, which, as you may know, was dominated and controlled by the Roman Empire. And when we do that, we discover very little of what we cry persecution about is at all like what Jesus faced, and therefore had very little to do with what Jesus addressed. And I think this is really important for us to grasp. I had a conversation several weeks ago about somebody who was quite sure that God's judgment and wrath was going to come quickly on America because of all the liberals and all of the ways in which they are destroying our country. And in this person's mind, what he meant was that the position that we once held as a country, he feels, is no longer there. But the reason why he's so convinced God's judgment and wrath is coming on those people is because he is certain that the position he once experienced in this country was also shared and appreciated by God himself. Now, that's a really bold claim to make. He makes it without realizing what he's making. He makes the claim that God was pleased when America served him, meaning my friend, this person that I had a conversation with, but that God is now upset in the same way this person is upset that the country is no longer what it used to be. Now, granted, sometimes there are things in life that are good, and it is a sad day when we lose those things. But what Jesus wants to make sure his disciples understand is that there is a level at which you can rejoice and be glad because you're in good company. And when I think about being in good company, what I think often about are our brothers and sisters in Christ all over the world, in nations where it is actually illegal to possess a Bible, where it is actually illegal to gather for worship services. But people do it anyway because they find great hope and they find great encouragement from doing things like that. And then people literally are arrested and their churches are actually bombed or burned to the ground, and people's lives are at risk for being in a place where they are talking about Jesus to somebody, a prison guard, or talking about Jesus to their neighbors, and they're actually suffering for it. Jesus' words of encouragement are received by them as encouragement. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. And I think what it does for me when I read these accounts of these pastors and these kids who are standing for truth and loving the very people who are mistreating them, it is an otherworldly type of response. They're not bickering and complaining that the laws don't favor them. They're not bickering and complaining that the wicked people in the world are in positions of power. Quite surely they're praying that the Lord's ways would come to fruition on the earth as it is in heaven, which is a prayer that we all ought to pray. But if you blow right by Jesus' expectation that we will see such positions as blessed, and if we blow right by his exhortation that we ought to rejoice and be glad in the midst of that, what we are doing is we are bypassing the wonderful opportunity of coming to know Jesus, as Paul says, in his sufferings. Paul says that it's a privileged position for him to be able to know Christ at the level of Christ's sufferings, and for God himself to allow Paul to share in the sufferings of Christ. Paul sees that as the privileged position, not the privileged position that we get to do whatever we want without anybody standing in our way. And that's why I introduced Emerson's quote at the beginning, not to think that we are being persecuted simply when we are being contradicted. Because in our society today, if you contradict me, if you don't agree fully with what I think, then I cancel you, right? And I've heard plenty of Christians who get up in arms about the cancel culture. Guess what, guys? We do the same thing. Christians do the same thing. They cancel other Christians who don't agree with their denominational convictions. They cancel non-Christians who don't respect their own Christian convictions. People cancel people all the time. It happens both within and outside the church. And so it really, I don't get tired of hearing it because I expect it now. But when a Christian says to me, "Oh, this cancel culture, I can't believe it's just so terrible." Well, guess what? We're a part of the culture. And if you aren't guarding yourself against the same temptations, you will, in the name of Jesus, cancel somebody else. That's just what we're doing. And that's why when Emerson says, don't make the terrible mistake of believing that you are being persecuted whenever you are contradicted, because sometimes we need people to contradict us. We need to recognize that some of what we think and believe and say isn't exactly accurate. And we might need somebody to correct that in us. Imagine a world where we were so certain of our own convictions that we never allowed anybody to contradict us. Well, when you get real comfortable in that world, what I've found is that you also don't allow Jesus to contradict you, because he all of a sudden then becomes the kind of savior who loves all the same people you love, wishes that America was the America you want it to be. And before you know it, he's a God who basically just thinks all the same things you do. And that's a precarious place to find oneself, because I am not at all ready to admit that the place I am is exactly where Jesus says that I should be. The moment I get to that point, I cease needing him. I cease growing. I cease being prepared to be conformed more to his own image. And that's a scary place to find yourself, to be honest. So Jesus is not encouraging us to view loss of privilege as persecution. And I think the church in America needs to take a long, hard look at many of the actual ways that we have been privileged. I know there is a lot of fighting going on right now and a lot of bickering about, wokeness and, oh my gosh, are you woke? Are you one of those woke people? And it's spoken about in such derogatory terms. But the word woke just means to be awake, to come to see something that you hadn't seen before. And, I read in Ephesians 5, for instance, where Paul says for us to take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, "Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." So to Paul in Ephesians 5, he exhorts people to wake up. Wake up from your slumber. And part of that slumber in Paul's mind is recognizing that we oftentimes unknowingly are participating in unfruitful works of darkness. Well, guess what? When Paul exhorts us to expose those things, if and when somebody does expose those things, if you just label them woke, and that's the reason why they're exposing things that are in darkness, they're bringing things into the light, and you just say, "Oh, well, to believe that is to be woke, so I'm just going to reject that," there's a chance that what you're rejecting is them bringing something into the light that needs to be brought into the light. Now, I'm not going to go down a rabbit trail and define everything about what wokeness means. I mean, I've heard some people suggest that who don't like the term. I want to hear what they're saying, because I don't have a problem with it myself. But they're saying, well, if you're woke, to be white at all means that you're a white supremacist. And there's no, if you're white, you're just racist. Well, I think we need a little nuance here. One of the reasons why some of the pushback is coming so strongly is because when somebody says black people are unfairly treated in this country and have been since its inception, your ability to hear that as a legitimate critique is dependent entirely upon your own view of what America is anyway. So if America is an innocent, great city on a hill, then if you critique it, it begins to crumble that perfect picture that you have. And so what people need to realize is that their ability or their willingness to listen to critique is always connected to their own evaluation of that thing in the first place. And what that means for you and me is that means that there might be times where we have an unbiblical view of something that needs corrected. We need to wake up to the reality that something might be actually different than what we've always believed. And I would suggest to you that what I'm talking about today on the podcast is something that some people need to wake up to. And that is that loss of privilege isn't the same thing as persecution. Well, in order to get that point across, I would have to be able to convince you that a lot of what Christians have experienced in this country has been privilege. And yet that's another word that seems to be poo-pooed pretty strongly by those who are against the woke community. I mean, that word is so dumb, really, but it just means to wake up. And it shows up in Ephesians 5. It shows up in Revelation 3, for goodness sakes. John is writing, Jesus is talking to the church in Sardis. And he says, I know your works. You have the reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Wake up and strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have not found your works complete in the sight of my God. Now that one is a punch in the mouth. You have the reputation of being alive, but you're actually dead. Wake up, Jesus says, and strengthen what remains and is about to die. Now, that's a word for the church today in every age. And that is, sometimes we have our own views of what we think about ourselves, and yet Jesus doesn't share our assessment. And I think today there is a healthy amount of things that need to be brought into the light, as Paul says in Ephesians 5, and that we would wake up and let the light of Christ shine on us. There are a lot of things today that Christians defend and seek to protect in order to maintain their sense of closeness with Jesus. But a lot of times those things don't have to be defended in order to maintain closeness with Jesus. But sometimes we shut out the truth because we're not sure we're ready to handle it. We're not sure we're capable of internalizing it in some way. And so the quickest way to get out from underneath that uncomfortable realization is to label the information we are now receiving as wokeness, bad thinking, and we can just reject it because we're good Christians. I think sometimes we might need, as Paul says, to recognize that the days are evil and to take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. Now, I know there are some Christians who think that exposing the works of darkness is to expose wokeness for being a terrible ideology. And again, I think we need a bit more nuance before we just decide that a call to wake up from slumber is a bad way of living. It isn't. It's very, very Christ-focused. And for us to try on what we hear and say, is this consistent with what it means to actually follow Jesus? And I'll tell you, it's shocking to me how few people that I have interacted with, or articles that I've read, or people I've spoken to in person will typically compare present-day American Christianity with first-century Christianity. The fact that Jesus' kingdom came and exploded in the midst of the Roman Empire is one of the biggest conundrums we will face today in the modern West. And that is that we do not need a government in favor of our religious belief in order for our religious belief to make a meaningful difference in our lives and in the lives of those around us. Excuse me. We just don't need it. We don't need it because it's not a part of what it means to follow Jesus. If following Jesus means you are blessed when you are persecuted, and that you ought to rejoice when you are reviled and slandered and maligned on account of Jesus, then we aren't here to fight for more privileged positions. We're here to live out an alternative way of life in the midst of a world that thinks the only way to be happy is to have your view perpetuated onto everybody else. That's not what it means to be a Christian, which is why it's such an oxymoron to imagine a nation that is a Christian nation. It doesn't exist. You do not have a nation who is eager to rejoice and be glad when they are suffering mistreatment on account of the name of Jesus. Baked into the American system is that we want to be a privileged people over and against everybody in the world. And then baked into America itself is that certain people within America need to be privileged over other people in America. That's just what nations do. I'm not criticizing America any more than I'd criticize or critique any other nation. But the fact remains, Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. It's not attached to having a privileged position. Jesus shows up with people and in places where there is a lack of privilege, where people literally don't have an advantage. They don't have a leg up. They might have 3 legs down. Jesus shows up in power and in his presence within the kingdom, specifically in places where there is no privilege. And so it's fascinating to me, not that we're losing our Christian heritage and we're losing. You're never going to find yourself in a place where you can no longer rejoice and be glad that you are being maligned for the name of Jesus. So don't confuse the two. There are times, and it will really hurt, and it will be hard, and it will be discouraging when you really do what you believe is the right thing for the right reasons, and you really truly have searched your own heart, and you have asked others and invited them into the process as well to see, do I have some malicious vendetta going in my own heart? Are my motives pure here? And then you have somebody who explicitly, for the reasons of you being faithful to Jesus, like you siding with somebody who is being left out or who is being mistreated, and then you actually end up being mistreated because or falsely accused of, well, that person just, whatever, his standards for truth have been lowered because he's willing to associate with that kind of a person. And I'm just not gonna tolerate that because, I follow Jesus, and Jesus says that that's a sinful practice. Have you ever met Christians like that? Do you ever wonder what it was like for Jesus, who was a friend of tax collectors and sinners, and what people said of him and what they must have thought he thought about God? Well, certainly Jesus isn't from God, because if he was, he would know what kind of a person he's associating with. I mean, Jesus got this all the time. In other words, he's being maligned and mistreated, and people are saying false things about him because he is actually pursuing real righteousness. And this happened in our church just this past week, is I was accused falsely of saying some things that were incorrect and unhelpful in our church, and loving some people in our church and caring for them in a way that this person didn't feel was appropriate, and has now labeled me as somebody who doesn't deserve to be in a position of leadership at this church, and wishes that they could get me fired. And it's a weird situation to find yourself in. It's a really, really weird situation. And I have to evaluate, is what this person is saying true? Is this what I asked for when I signed up to lead a church? What does it really mean to live righteously and faithfully? And what does it mean when you receive persecution or mistreatment or being maligned or reviled because of that? Not because I didn't handle a situation well, not because I got, upset with a church member and told him off, in the foyer after the service or anything like that. It's saying, you're pursuing me, Jesus says. And when you do, expect to be treated the way I was treated. And this is why I say the Sermon on the Mount, I feel like, is the most forgotten section of the Bible. The Sermon on the Mount is nothing more than Jesus' teaching in more or less biographical form of his own life. So Jesus rejoiced. He came from the Father. He knew he was going to return to the Father. But the life he experienced on this earth was so different from what you might imagine he would experience, right? If God himself actually came. And this is what I see a lot. I see Christians spending a lot of time and energy fighting over being so influential in positions of power that they can virtually create a world around them where they'll never receive mistreatment as a result of their faith in Jesus. And so we build these worlds and we build these cultures and we build these systems that guarantee we will receive privilege, which is synonymous with guaranteeing we will never suffer for the name of Jesus. Now, I'm not asking us to suffer. Suffering is terrible. It's horrible. It's not something that anybody enjoys. It's not something that anybody looks forward to. It certainly better not be something that somebody is trying to, figure out how to get persecuted in their own life. But it's a reality that Jesus expresses. The world in which you live will never line itself up with the truth of who I am as the Messiah and the way I choose to rule the world. As we're going to look at in the next couple of weeks, the only way to do that is to be my people, the people of the Beatitudes, who are the salt and light in this world. That's what you are. And the way you do that isn't by putting yourself at the top, but the way you do that is by continually choosing to find reasons to rejoice in me in the middle of a life that does not treat you as you would imagine it should. That's how it happens. And so when loss of privilege takes place, instead of panicking, what we actually ought to do is say, Jesus, reorient our hearts to the real ways of the kingdom. Not the ways we've grown comfortable with in our positions of privilege, but reorient us so that we are able to still see you as the King and still rejoice in what it means to follow you, even as our positions of privilege are crumbling and fading away. That is a prayer that Jesus will undoubtedly answer, because he truly wants to free us from feeling as if being in positions of privilege is the only way to faithfully follow him. That's actually a sham. And so in some strange way, it's a blessing in disguise when privilege starts crumbling around us, because it lets us see, if we have the eyes to see, and if we, like Paul says, are ready to wake up, or when Jesus exhorts the church in Sardis to wake up and to strengthen what remains. That's what he's calling us to do. He's calling us to see true Christian faith for what it is, true followership of him for what it is, and allow the privileges to fade away, and to see the beauty of Christ continue to shine forth, because he's showing us and he's showing the world what it really looks like to live in an alternative kingdom. And so privilege, loss of privilege versus persecution. Don't mistake the two. They're not the same thing. One, the loss of privilege, could actually lead to a richer, more fulfilling life. But we might need to wake up to the realities that certain places in our lives have been privileged, and that it has actually prevented us from seeing the beauty of Christ because we expect those things to continue to be there. Well, if they're not there, like they never were in Jesus's day, then I want us to get back to that point. Because I want us to realize our role as Christians can't be any different than the role of Christians in the first century. I mean, it can look different and because we live in a different place, but our goal and our perspectives aren't going to be the same. We're not going to look at the world in the same way. But But what we need to see is that Jesus is interested in transforming us as his followers. And one of the only ways he can do that is to strip away the things that we've learned to rely on and count on and depend on, so that we might just be able to see him and see that he's enough, and to see that his ways of righteousness are truly sustaining. And that's where we'll find hope. And that's where we'll find life. And we can love the people that we perceive are attempting to take away our privileges, because we don't need our privileges in order to function and flourish as Christ's followers. If you've grown super comfortable with those things, there will be an adjustment period that you'll have to go through, but it's worth it. Because for Jesus to suggest that his kingdom will have no end and to introduce us to eternal life, that simply means that nothing about what it means to follow Jesus can ever be taken away from you. Well, if you attach your heart too closely to positions of privilege in this world, I assure you, those things can be taken away from you. And if you go down with the ship because you've attached your heart too closely to those things, you will not find the life that Jesus has come to offer the world. He's literally come to offer the world life that can't be taken away. And so a big part of our calling as his followers is to recognize all the things in life that we've built our lives on that can be taken away. Because to the extent that we split our heart and we give a little bit of loyalty to Jesus, but we give other loyalty to our possessions, and we give other loyalty to our privileged positions, and we give other loyalty to who we like serving in the White House, and we give other, then any of those things that aren't Jesus can be taken away. And if they're taken away, we'll get sucked right in with it. And that's not what he's calling us to. That is not a life where you can rejoice and be glad because you get discouraged and you get mad. That's not what he's calling us to. Rather, he's calling us to pursue him, to pursue love and relationship with one another, and to expect that to do it truly the way Jesus did it, it's not going to be well received. You're not going to be applauded. You're not going to be encouraged. People might not thank you, and it hurts. I know it does. But this is why Jesus' words are so encouraging, because he's the one telling us to rejoice and be glad, because we're in good company. God's faithful people throughout the centuries have all experienced the same rejection and mistreatment as a result of following him. But we are not seeking rewards in this life. We are not seeking thanks and praise and comfort in this life. We might get it at times, and hopefully when you meet a truly Christian friend, or hopefully the pastor of your church or some other godly individuals in your church, they can encourage you in these ways because they've experienced it too, and they know how to offer you hope and encouragement. So I hope you have people like that in your life that you can surround yourselves with as we continue to pursue Jesus together and learn what it actually means to pursue righteousness. So that is all the time that I have for this week. I really hope that you're encouraged by these episodes. Thanks again for sharing them with friends or family members who you think might be encouraged. As I said, if you have any comments, questions, if you want a copy of that reading list, please email me at unbindingthebible@gmail.com. If you haven't already left me a rating or a review on whatever podcast app you choose to listen to these episodes, I ask you to do that. That would really help me and help others to be able to find the podcast as well. So I hope you have a fantastic week, and I'll talk to you next time.